listen to VOA, Japanese English listening material site with transcript. It's like a provocation to the United States. Xi Jinping danger of state guest invitation. Abe administration next year, 2020. Spring is promoting a plan to invite to Japan Xi Jinping Jintao with China as a state guest. The prospects for this plan to buy back from the international market are getting stronger. Voices of criticism are rising for Japan's policy toward reconciliation with China against the movement of democratic countries. In particular, there is a high risk that the U.S. policy toward China will be hindered. Condemnation and caution against China growing in the international community. Japan plans as a state guest of Xi Jinping Hu was also an issue in Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at the press conference of December 9th. A foreign reporter asked Prime Minister Abe's opinion. There is opposition within the Liberal Democratic Party to invite Xi as a national custodian while the Japanese restraint by China and the invasion of the Senkaku Islands continue, Prime Minister Abe replied. Both China and Japan have a responsibility to fulfill the peace and stability of Asia, so we will discuss that responsibility with Mr. Xi. There was no explanation as to whether it should be treated as a national flag that pushes welcome to the front rather than substantive consultation. However, in the current international community, contrary to Japan's movement toward reconciliation with China, blame and precautions against China are increasing. 29 countries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to which many Western European countries join, also raised the first challenge from China at the summit meeting held in early December. In the NATO declaration, summarizing the results of the summit, China declared the need for confrontation from the front for the first time, considering China's recent expansion of influence as a challenge. At the same time, in Western European countries, there is a growing blame for the suppression of ethnic minorities in China and the democratization movement in Hong Kong. Of particular concern to Japan is that the U.S., an allied country, has sharpened the attitude of confrontation with China. The majority of the Trump administration and the U.S. Parliament's bipartisan group came together to condemn China's human rights repression and take sanctions and retaliation. Most recently, there have been movements in the U.S. government and Parliament, such as the enforcement of the Hong Kong Human Rights Democracy Act, sanctions against human rights suppression in Tibet and Uyghur, and praise for Taiwan's democracy. All of this was a strong condemnation of the Chinese Communist Party administration against human rights. The United States has begun an attack on the heart of China. It can be said that the U.S. policy towards China has finally crossed the Rubicon River. This is because the condemnation against Chinese Communist government's human rights suppression become an attack on the heart of China. The Communist Party's dictatorship cannot continue indefinitely without human rights repression. Condemning the Communist Party's suppression of human rights denies the fundamental doctrine that supports communism, that is, ideology. Why is the Trump administration recently blaming China against human rights repression? The speech by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo at the end of October explained why. Secretary Pompeo said, "The United States has so far underestimated the repression on the Chinese Communist Party's human rights and its hostility to the ideological democratic camp. The issues between the United States and China can no longer be discussed without mentioning the fundamental differences in their ideology." Mr. Pompeo also told us about this. The Chinese Communist Party ideology will not hesitate from the use of military power or intimidation to struggle with democratic countries such as the United States and conquer the world. That's why the United States needs to confront China's threat in collaboration with democracies around the world. Reading this part, it is obvious that the United States is seeking Japan's attitude to confrontation with China. However, the Japanese government that does not have nearly the power to compete with China in a military plane declared happily to invite Xi Jinping Hu who is the supreme leader of Chinese Communist Party, as a state guest. That attitude is the opposite of U.S. policy. Such a Japan to China reconciliation policy could be a hindrance to the U.S. attitude toward China. In fact, in the United States, the Abe administration's approach to China has been pointed out with concern. There is also a reaction that hinders U.S. policy toward China. Inviting Xi as a state guest by Japan is the greatest treatment for the chief executive of the repression of human rights that the U.S. condemns. It would not be strange to ACC